When the time comes to decide where to place a loved one in their twilight years, families face one of the hardest choices of their lives. For many, nursing homes seem like a safe harbor, a place where elderly parents and grandparents will receive the care and attention they deserve. We picture bright rooms, friendly staff, and peaceful days filled with companionship. But what if I told you this picture is often just a fragile illusion? Behind the glossy brochures and reassuring smiles, nursing homes can hide a darker reality, one that too few families ever discover until it's too late. It's a reality woven with neglect, unseen dangers, and heartbreaking compromises. The very places we trust to protect our elders sometimes become the source of their greatest vulnerabilities. This isn't about one or two bad experiences here and there. It's about deep, systemic problems, issues so ingrained that they often remain invisible to outsiders. They lurk quietly behind locked doors and in hushed hallways, waiting to reveal themselves in moments of crisis. There are 5 hidden dangers every family must understand before making this critical decision. Dangers that threaten not just the health, but the dignity and humanity of those we love most. These are truths nursing homes don't advertise, stories families rarely hear, and risks that can quietly destroy lives. As we peel back the layers, you'll hear stories of real people, faces behind the statistics. You'll understand how understaffed care teams can overlook basic needs, how abuse can go unspoken, how infections silently spread, and how the loss of independence can erode the very soul of an individual. You'll also learn about the financial traps that can strain families long after their loved ones have been admitted. But this isn't just a tale of warning. It's a call to awareness, a reminder that caring for our elders is far more than a checkbox on a to-do list. It's a sacred responsibility that demands vigilance, compassion, and knowledge. Because behind every nursing home door, there is a story, sometimes full of hope, but often shadowed by struggle. And it's up to us to listen carefully, ask the hard questions, and protect the dignity of those who once cared for us. So let's begin this journey together, not just to uncover the harsh truths, but to empower families with the understanding they need to make informed choices. Because in the end, every elder deserves to live their final years with respect, love, and safety, no matter where they call home. It's easy to believe that when your loved one steps into a nursing home, they enter a world where every need is anticipated, every discomfort soothed, and every moment carefully tended. After all, that's what the brochures promise. That's what the staff assure. That's what families hope for. But the truth, reality often falls painfully short of these promises. Nursing homes, especially those stretched thin by limited budgets and high demand, face a harsh truth. Personalized care is a luxury they simply can't afford. Beneath the surface of routine checklists and scheduled activities lies a cold reality. Too many residents, too few caregivers, and precious little time for genuine connection. Picture this: a nurse with a dozen patients on her watch, moving from one bed to the next, pressured by time, overwhelmed by tasks, and often forced to prioritize the most urgent needs. The subtle cues of pain, loneliness, or discomfort can easily slip through the cracks. The simple warmth of a familiar voice or a gentle touch becomes a rare gift, rather than a given. And it's not just about physical care. The elderly, more than anyone, crave dignity, respect, and a sense that they are seen as individuals, not just another body to manage. When care becomes transactional, when the humanity of a person is lost in a sea of procedures, the soul begins to wither. This illusion of care, where quantity replaces quality, can leave residents feeling isolated even in a crowded room. Their unique stories, preferences, and histories fade into the background as the clock ticks on. Families visiting their loved ones often notice this shift. The sparkle in their relatives' eyes dims. The laughter grows less frequent. The warmth of personalized attention becomes a distant memory. And this is the first hidden danger: the gradual disappearance of the very care that was promised. It's a danger that undermines not only physical health but emotional well-being. Because when someone's needs are overlooked, when their pain goes unnoticed, the decline becomes inevitable and heartbreakingly fast. But recognizing this illusion is the first step to challenging it. It's a call to look beyond the surface, to ask tough questions, and to demand more, not just for our elders, but for the caregivers stretched too thin to provide it. Because care is not a checklist, it's a sacred act of presence. And when personalized attention disappears, so does the true meaning of care. There's a silence that fills the halls of many nursing homes, a silence that speaks louder than words. It's the silence of pain hidden behind closed doors, of voices too weak or afraid to speak up. Abuse in nursing homes is a dark reality that few want to confront, but it's one that leaves scars deeper than any bruise. Abuse doesn't always look like what we imagine. It's not always loud or violent. Sometimes it's the quiet neglect, the forgotten meal, the unattended call button, the hurried shove. Sometimes it's the harsh words, the impatient glare, or the refusal to listen. And sometimes it's far worse. Physical harm, emotional torment, or even financial exploitation. For the elderly, who often depend entirely on their caregivers, abuse can feel like a prison. There's nowhere to run, no one to turn to. Many suffer in silence, ashamed or afraid to tell their families what's really happening. These invisible wounds are just as damaging, if not more so, than physical injuries. They erode trust, shatter dignity, and steal the very essence of a person's spirit. The scars are silent, but their impact lasts a lifetime. Families may notice subtle signs: withdrawal, sudden fear, unexplained bruises. But often, these signals are dismissed or misunderstood. And the staff, overworked, undertrained, sometimes overwhelmed, they may fail to recognize or admit the abuse happening under their watch. The harsh truth is this: abuse in nursing homes is not rare. It is a hidden epidemic that preys on the most vulnerable, cloaked in secrecy and denial. But acknowledging this reality is the first step toward change. It's a call for vigilance, for advocacy, and for a relentless pursuit of justice. Because every elder deserves to be safe, respected, and loved, not just cared for. When we uncover the silent scars, we give voice to those who cannot speak. We shine a light on the darkness, and we begin to heal. In the quiet corners of nursing homes, an invisible enemy thrives, one that too often goes unnoticed until it's too late. Infection and poor hygiene are a hidden epidemic, silently sweeping through these facilities and striking the most vulnerable among us. Elderly bodies are naturally more fragile, their immune systems weakened by time, chronic illnesses, and medications. A simple infection that a younger person might shrug off can become life-threatening for someone in their 70s, 80s, or beyond. Yet the very places entrusted with protecting them sometimes become breeding grounds for illness. Crowded rooms, shared bathrooms, and communal dining spaces. These are perfect conditions for bacteria and viruses to spread unchecked. Add to that the challenge of understaffing and insufficient training. When caregivers are stretched thin, the basics, like proper hand washing, sanitizing surfaces, and attentive personal hygiene, can slip through the cracks, and the consequences can be devastating. Outbreaks of respiratory infections, urinary tract infections, and skin wounds infected by poor care are more common than most families realize. Each case not only threatens the health of one resident, but puts the entire community at risk. What makes this crisis even more heartbreaking is its preventability. Many infections can be avoided with simple, consistent hygiene practices and vigilant care. But the reality is far from ideal. Families often trust nursing homes to maintain a clean, safe environment. They assume their loved ones are receiving the care needed to protect them from harm. And yet, when infection strikes, it exposes a fracture in the system, where care falls short and lives hang in the balance. This hidden epidemic is a stark reminder that quality care requires more than just medical knowledge. It demands respect, attention to detail, and an unwavering commitment to the dignity and safety of every resident. Because in the battle against infection, vigilance is life itself. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the simple freedoms you once took for granted, dressing yourself, choosing what to eat, or even moving around your own home, are slipping away. For many elderly people in nursing homes, this loss of independence is a cruel and invisible prison. It's not just the physical limitations that confine them, it's the gradual erosion of their sense of self. When the ability to make choices is taken away, so too is the dignity that comes with autonomy. The daily routines once filled with meaning become regimented schedules, leaving residents feeling like mere cogs in a machine. But the prison extends beyond the body. Cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's, confusion, wraps its cold fingers around minds that once sparkled with memories, dreams, and wisdom. Nursing homes, while intended to be sanctuaries, can sometimes become places where minds quietly fade, unnoticed in the background of routine care. This loss is often invisible to the outside world. Families may see the changes, but struggle to understand the emotional toll it takes. The frustration, fear, and loneliness experienced by elders stripped of their independence can be overwhelming. The very environment designed to provide safety can, paradoxically, contribute to this decline. Overprotectiveness and lack of stimulating engagement can accelerate cognitive deterioration. When elders are not encouraged to participate actively in their own care and daily life, their minds lose the vital exercise that keeps them sharp and engaged. This invisible prison, a loss of freedom and mental clarity, is one of the most heartbreaking realities of nursing home life. It is a slow, silent fading away of who a person truly is. Recognizing this is not just about empathy, it is about action. It is about fighting to preserve autonomy, fostering respect, and creating environments where elders can thrive, mind, body, and soul. Because freedom is more than movement, it's the essence of being alive. For many families, placing a loved one in a nursing home is not just an emotional decision. It's a financial commitment that can quietly spiral out of control. Behind the facade of care and compassion, there lies a hidden danger. The financial trap. Nursing homes are expensive. The costs can quickly drain savings, pensions, and insurance, leaving families caught in a relentless cycle of bills and payments. But it's not just the price tag that threatens, it's how that money is handled or mishandled. In some cases, residents become victims of financial exploitation, hidden fees, unnecessary services, or worse, outright fraud. The complexity of billing and the lack of transparency create a murky world where abuse can thrive unnoticed. For elderly residents who may struggle with memory or decision-making, trusting the financial aspects to others can open doors to manipulation and loss. Families, too, may be left in the dark, blindsided by mounting costs they didn't anticipate. This financial strain doesn't just impact bank accounts, it eats away at peace of mind, relationships, and the dignity of those involved. The constant worry over money can overshadow the very purpose of care, comfort, safety, and respect. The financial trap is a hidden danger that demands awareness and vigilance. It requires asking tough questions, scrutinizing contracts, and seeking professional advice. Because protecting your loved one's finances is as vital as protecting their health. In the end, money should never become another source of harm in a place meant to provide sanctuary. Yet, without caution, it too can become a prison, one that drains resources and hope alike. As we step back and reflect on the hidden truths behind nursing homes, it becomes clear that the challenges faced by our elders are complex, painful, and often overlooked. But within these shadows lies an opportunity, a chance to reshape how we think about and provide care for those who once cared for us. Elder care is not just about facilities or services. It's about respect, dignity, and recognizing the whole person, their history, their desires, their spirit. It calls for vigilance from families, accountability from caregivers, and a society willing to listen and act. Change begins with awareness. By shining a light on the hidden dangers, we empower ourselves to ask the right questions, to advocate fiercely, and to seek better solutions. Because every elder deserves not just to live, but to live well. As we close this chapter, remember that care is a shared responsibility, a promise we make to our parents, grandparents, and ourselves. Let us honor that promise by demanding transparency, compassion, and true kindness in every corner of elder care. If this message resonates with you, if you believe in standing up for those who cannot always stand for themselves, please like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can build a community where every elder's voice is heard and every life is valued. Thank you for listening, and may we all move forward with greater understanding and heart.